Hello, dear listeners. Welcome. Today, I've come with a story that will wash away all the day's fatigue and lull you into peaceful sleep. The 1,000-year secret of the Lost Brotherhood. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. And if you like, share your thoughts. I read all your comments. Your thoughts are very valuable to me. If you want to hear more stories like this, subscribe and like. It motivates me. Now relax and settle in. Take a deep breath. I leave you alone with Sherlock Holmes. A thick fog had settled over London. The air was gloomier than usual this morning. As a faint, pale light entered the window of Baker Street, Holmes's violin string, a strange melody echoed. But what was really interesting was not that Holmes wasn't talking this morning, but the strange smile on his face. Watson had been his friend for years, but he had never seen him start a morning so peaceful. As he slowly put his violin away, Holmes said, "Something will happen today, Watson. There's a smell in the air, haven't you noticed?" Watson took a sip of his coffee and settled comfortably into his chair by the fireplace. Despite the bitter cold outside, the room was warm thanks to the fire Mrs. Hudson had lit that morning. "The only thing I've noticed is that you seem more peaceful than usual today, Sherlock. Is there another mystery, or were you busy with those chemical experiments of yours all night?" Holmes laughed. It was a deep, heartfelt laugh. Even Watson was surprised. "No mystery, no experiments, Doctor. Just a feeling. You know, sometimes the universe whispers little clues to us. Most people can't hear them. But for those of us who can, life is always an interesting puzzle." Just then, footsteps sounded on the stairs. Mrs. Hudson knocked gently on the door. "Mr. Holmes, a letter has arrived for you. I just saw it, but it's been at the door since this morning. No one saw who left it or when." Holmes jumped up, his eyes sparkling. "Ah, here we go, Watson. Please bring it in, Mrs. Hudson." The elderly landlady entered, holding a lavender-scented, elegant envelope. The seal was wax, and there was a strange symbol on it. It looked like a bird, but its wings were curled inward. Holmes took the envelope, inhaled its scent, then held it up to the light. "Interesting," he said softly. "Very interesting. Watson, look at this. Tell me what you see." Watson took the envelope in his hand. He looked closely. A lavender-scented envelope. Quite expensive paper. The seal? I don't know, is this a bird? "Not just a bird," said Holmes, examining the edges of the envelope with his fingers. "A phoenix, the bird that rises from its ashes. But this version is different. Its wings are turned inward, a phoenix wrapped around itself. Symbolically very powerful. Not rebirth, but withdrawal, concealment, and lavender. Lavender brings peace, soothes, but it's also the classic plant of the Provence region. There could be a connection to France." He carefully opened the envelope. Two things came out, a letter written in beautiful handwriting and a small silver key. Holmes began to read the letter, his voice soft but focused. "Dear Mr. Holmes, we have never met, but your fame echoes throughout Europe. My hands are trembling as I write this letter to you, but it is not fear, it is excitement. I feel that the time has finally come to share a secret I have kept for years. My name is Madame Élodie Beaumont. I own a small flower shop in the Marais district of Paris, but my real profession is more complicated. I am a keeper of secrets. People come to me, tell me their stories, entrust me with their belongings. I keep them safe, never telling anyone. However, last week a client of mine died, an elderly English gentleman, Lord Edmund Ashworth. 3 days before his death, he came to me and entrusted me with a trunk. "If anything happens to me," he said, "deliver this trunk to Sherlock Holmes. Only he can understand what's inside." Mr. Holmes, this trunk is currently in Paris, in the basement of my shop. Lord Ashworth's death was officially recorded as a heart attack. But I'm suspicious. He was very agitated during that last visit, constantly looking around. My request is this: come to Paris and retrieve this box. I don't know what's inside, but my intuition tells me it's important. Perhaps it's what caused Lord Ashworth's demise. The silver key is the key to the back door of my shop. It would be safer if you came at night. No one should see us. Address: 47, Rue des Rosiers, Marais, Paris. Sincerely, Elodie Beaumont P.S. I love lavender. It brings me peace. I hope it brings you peace too. When Holmes finished the letter, he had that familiar look on his face. Watson knew it well, a mixture of curiosity, excitement, and calculation. "What do you say, Watson? A little trip to Paris?" Watson smiled. "Sherlock, you started packing your bags in your mind the moment you received this letter. Had you heard the name Lord Ashworth before?" "Edmund Ashworth," said Holmes, walking over to the fireplace and looking out the window. "Yes, I've heard the name. Diplomat, collector, mysterious man. Quite well known in the art world, particularly interested in ancient manuscripts and lost works. A few years ago he found a Renaissance-era manuscript that caused quite a stir. But in recent years he's become quiet, withdrawn from society." "And now he's dead," said Watson thoughtfully. "By giving your name." "Exactly," said Holmes. There was a gleam in his eyes. "This, Watson, is no ordinary case. It's an invitation, a riddle, and Lord Ashworth wants me to solve this riddle. But why? If he was truly in danger, why didn't he go to the police? Why didn't he use diplomatic channels? Why did he go to a French florist and give the name of an English detective?" Watson stood up, finishing his coffee and placing the cup on the table. "Perhaps the answer is in that box." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But what interests me more is Madame Beaumont herself. A keeper of secrets. What does that mean exactly? Why do people confide in her? Was she just a florist, or was she something more?" As the day progressed, Holmes and Watson made preparations to go to Paris. Holmes packed only the essentials in his travel bag: a magnifying glass, a notebook, some chemical equipment, and of course, his violin. Watson was more practical: clothes, his medical bag, and his pistol. "A pistol, Watson?" asked Holmes, raising an eyebrow. "Isn't that a bit much for a peaceful trip to Paris?" "Have you ever been on a peaceful trip, Sherlock?" replied Watson. "Every time, a murder, a mystery, a danger. I prefer to be prepared." The evening train took them away from London and towards the English Channel. In the train compartment, Holmes was quiet, looking out the window. Watson watched him. He knew how his friend's mind worked. Right now, he was probably considering every possible scenario, calculating probabilities, connecting clues. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "what do you know about lavender?" "Lavender?" Watson was surprised. "As far as I know, it's a fragrant plant. It has soothing properties. It grows abundantly in France, especially in the south." "Correct," said Holmes. "But lavender is also a symbol: purity, loyalty, peace. Why did Madame Beaumont sprinkle lavender scent on the letter? Was it just a nice gesture, or was it a message?" "Maybe she just liked it," Watson said reasonably. "You don't have to look for meaning in everything, Sherlock." "But, Watson, there is meaning behind everything," said Holmes with a smile. "We just have to know how to look. Madame Beaumont is a careful woman. Her choice of lavender was not random. She is trying to tell us something. The train moved through the night. Outside, the English countryside flew by, then the canal crossing, then French territory. Holmes didn't speak during the journey, but Watson knew he was listening. The way to rest Holmes's mind was to give him an interesting problem, and right now, he had the perfect one. They arrived in Paris in the early hours of the morning. The city was still asleep. The streets were quiet, with only a few bakers and milkmen at work. Holmes and Watson hired a horse-drawn carriage and headed for the Marais district. The Marais was It was famous for its narrow streets, historic buildings and small craft shops. Rue des Rosiers was in the heart of the Jewish quarter. The street took its name from the rose gardens here. Rosier meant roses. The building at number 47 was small but elegant. There was a florist's shop on the ground floor, with colourful flowers displayed in the window. But the shop was closed. Holmes took the silver key from the envelope and headed for a narrow passageway next to the shop. The back door was there, wooden and old. The key turned smoothly in the lock. The door opened with a slight creak. It was dark inside, but Holmes took a candle from his pocket and lit it. In the candlelight, a small corridor appeared. Dried flowers hung from the ceiling, lavender, roses, daisies. The air was thick with the scent of flowers. "Madame Beaumont," Holmes called softly. "Sherlock Holmes is here. I received your letter." A sound was heard from above. Light footsteps. Then a woman appeared at the top of the stairs. She was old, perhaps 60, but her eyes were young and lively. Her grey hair was tied in a knot at the back of her head, and her dress was simple but elegant. She was holding a candle. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice soft with a French accent. "You've come. Thank you very much. And you must be Dr. Watson. Welcome." "Madame Beaumont," Holmes said politely. "Your letter interested us greatly. You mentioned Lord Ashworth's trunk." "Yes," said Madame Beaumont, starting down the stairs. "Downstairs in the basement. But first, may I offer you some coffee? You've had a long journey." Holmes hesitated for a moment. Watson knew he was impatient. He wanted to see the trunk immediately. But Holmes was also a gentleman. "That's very kind of you, madame. A little coffee would be most welcome." Madame Beaumont led them into a small kitchen. It was at the back of the shop, and the first light of morning was streaming in through the window. She expertly prepared the coffee, strong, French-style coffee. Then she sat down and looked Holmes straight in the eye. "Mr. Holmes," she said slowly, "I'm not just a florist. Perhaps I hinted at it in my letter. I'm a keeper of secrets. People come to me, they entrust things to me. Sometimes objects, sometimes just stories. I keep them, I tell no one. It's a family tradition. My mother did it. My grandmother did it." "An interesting profession," said Holmes. "But isn't it dangerous? People's secrets are heavy burdens." "Yes," said Madame Beaumont, "but I chose to carry that burden, because some secrets deserve to be kept. Some stories must remain hidden until the right time comes." "And Lord Ashworth's secret?" asked Watson. "Has the right time come?" Madame Beaumont's eyes moistened. She opened her lips to answer Watson's question, but paused. She stared at her coffee for a moment, then took a deep breath. "I've known Lord Ashworth for 10 years. When he first came, he was a young man, perhaps your age, Mr. Holmes. He often came to Paris on diplomatic business. One day he walked into my shop and asked for lavender. 'I'm sending it to my mother,' he said. 'She's ill, and lavender soothes her. There was a silence in the room. Outside, a child's laughter could be heard on the street, but inside, time seemed to stand still. After that day, Madame Beaumont continued, he began to come regularly, not just for flowers, to talk. Sometimes he would sit for hours telling stories, places he had seen, people he had met, treasures he had found. Lord Ashworth wasn't just a collector, he was a story hunter. He believed every antique had a story, and he wanted to find those stories and preserve them. Holmes leaned forward. So, what did he entrust to you? At first it was small things, said Madame Beaumont. A letter, a photograph, a piece of jewellery. But over time more important things began to arrive. Lord Ashworth witnessed many things during his diplomatic missions. Some were dangerous secrets, and he didn't want those secrets to be lost, but at the same time, he couldn't keep them openly. So you became his archive, said Holmes thoughtfully. A safe place to keep his secrets. Yes, said Madame Beaumont, and this last box. He was very different when he came for it. He was afraid. I had never seen him so afraid. Elodie, he said, if anything happens to me, this box must reach Sherlock Holmes. No one else. Only he can understand. I asked her, why Holmes? Why a detective from England? Because, she said, he's a man who sees not only what is seen, but also what is unseen. And there are things unseen in this box. Watson looked at Holmes in astonishment. There was a strange expression on his friend's face. Pride or concern, he couldn't tell. May we see the box? Holmes asked softly. Madame Beaumont stood up. Of course. But I must tell you one more thing. After Lord Ashworth died, strange things started happening in my shop. At night, I hear footsteps. It's as if someone is watching. Yesterday, a man came in to buy flowers. But he didn't look at the flowers, he looked at me and the shop. He asked questions. Do you live here alone? Do you have a basement? I didn't answer. I tried to send him away. But he didn't leave right away. He wandered around the shop for minutes. Can you describe the man? Asked Watson, instantly alert. He was tall, thin. He had very pale skin, almost sickly. His eyes were very strange, as if they were empty. Eyes that looked but did not see. Holmes and Watson looked at each other. This description was a sign that the danger was real. Madame Beaumont led them to a small door in the corner of the kitchen. When she opened it, a narrow staircase appeared leading down. The basement. There was the chest. The stairs were wooden and creaked with every step down. The basement was larger than they had expected. The ceiling was low, but the room stretched long and deep. There were shelves along the walls, and on the shelves were hundreds of boxes, chests, packages. Each one held someone's secret. Here, said Madame Beaumont, pointing to a medium-sized chest at the end of the room. Lord Ashworth's last bequest. The chest was made of wood, dark walnut. It was intricately carved. Flowers, birds, strange symbols. Holmes approached and examined the chest carefully. There was no lock. No. Lock? Said Holmes. Interesting. So Lord Ashworth wanted the chest to be opened, but only by the right person. How so? Asked Watson. Look, Watson, said Holmes, pointing to the carvings on the chest's lid. These symbols aren't random. They form a code. To open the chest, you need to know the correct sequence. Holmes ran his fingers over the symbols. A flower, a bird, a moon, a star, a tree. 5 symbols. Holmes closed his eyes and began to think. Lord Ashworth was a diplomat, a collector, a story hunter, he murmured. What symbols would he use? What did he value? There was silence for a few minutes. Then Holmes's eyes opened. He was smiling. Of course, the phoenix, the bird that rises from its ashes, the seal on Madame Beaumont's letter, Lord Ashworth's favourite symbol. Holmes touched the bird symbol and pressed it lightly. A click was heard. Then the flower. Click. The tree. Click. The moon. Click. The star. Click. The lid of the chest slowly opened. Inside there were lots of documents, old papers, letters, photographs. But on top there was an old notebook bound with a leather cover. Holmes took the notebook and opened the first page. The handwriting was elegant, but hastily written. This diary belongs to Edmund Ashworth. If you are reading these lines, it means I am no longer alive, and it means you are Sherlock Holmes. Holmes continued reading the page aloud. Mr. Holmes, I have much to tell you. But first, there is something you must know. This is not a murder case. This is a mystery case. And the secret is about a man's identity. I have travelled the world throughout my life. Diplomatic missions, collecting pursuits, adventure. But 20 years ago, I found something in Egypt. Something that changed everything. An ancient manuscript. But not just any manuscript. The final record of the Lost Brotherhood. The Lost Brotherhood. Have you heard of it? Probably not. Because history erased them. But 1,000 years ago, this brotherhood existed. Wise men, philosophers, inventors. People who preserved knowledge. But not just knowledge. Lost knowledge. Forgotten stories, erased truths, dangerous secrets. In that writing, there was a note from the Brotherhood's last member. It said, "Knowledge will not be lost. Even if we are gone, the treasure will remain. And one day, the right person will find it. That person must be one who sees the unseen." Mr. Holmes, I've been searching for that treasure for 20 years. And finally, I found the clues. But at the same time, I realized someone was following me. Someone wants what I found. And that person doesn't care if I die. In this box are all my findings. Maps, notes, clues. But most importantly, the final clue. That clue will lead you to the treasure. If you find it, the world will change. If you don't, the Lost Brotherhood will truly be lost. I trust you, Mr. Holmes, because you are the man who sees what is unseen. Edmund Ashworth. Holmes closed the notebook. A deep silence fell over the room. Watson looked at his friend's face. There was that familiar gleam in Holmes's eyes, the excitement of a man who had encountered a mystery. "Watson," Holmes said slowly, "an adventure awaits us. The Lost Brotherhood. 1,000-year-old secret. And someone may have killed Lord Ashworth to protect that secret." "But the letter is clear," said Watson. "Lord Ashworth died of a heart attack officially." "Officially," said Holmes, raising an eyebrow. "But Watson, a heart attack can be triggered. Poison, stress, fear. If someone wanted to kill Lord Ashworth, they would have preferred to do it in a way that looked natural." Madame Beaumont stood quietly in the corner. "Mr. Holmes," she said fearfully, "so Lord Ashworth really was murdered?" "I don't know, Madame," Holmes said honestly, "but I will find out. Now, we need to examine these documents, and you must be safe. If someone was following Lord Ashworth for his possessions, they know you are in danger too." "What should I do?" asked Madame Beaumont. "Leave Paris for a few days," said Holmes firmly. "Do you have a friend, a relative, perhaps in the country?" "I have a sister," said Madame Beaumont. "She lives in Normandy. on a small farm. "Perfect," said Holmes. "Leave today. We'll take this chest and examine it. We'll be in touch." Madame Beaumont nodded, looking both relieved and anxious. Holmes and Watson carried the chest upstairs. It wasn't heavy, but it was valuable. The information inside might hold centuries of secrets. As they exited the shop's front door, the street was beginning to stir. People were heading to work, shops were opening. Holmes and Watson loaded the chest into a carriage and returned to the small hotel they had rented. The hotel was near the Seine River. It was small, but clean. When they reached their room, Holmes immediately placed the chest on the table and began to unpack its contents. The documents were arranged by year. The oldest dated back 20 years. Egypt, Cairo. Notes in Lord Ashworth's handwriting. March 12th, met with Dr. Farouk at the Cairo Museum. He showed me an old parchment, written in Coptic. We translated it. Wisdom is not lost, only hidden. 7 cities, 7 keys, 1 treasure. What does it mean? Holmes examined the documents one by one. Each one followed the trail of the Lost Brotherhood. Athens, Rome, Istanbul, Baghdad, Delhi, Beijing. Lord Ashworth had travelled the world, finding clues everywhere. "Look, Watson," said Holmes, unfolding a map. Lord Ashworth found 7 cities. In each city, a member of the Brotherhood lived, and everywhere they left a clue. But the clues are meaningless on their own. You have to put them all together. "And did he do that?" asked Watson. "Almost," said Holmes. "Look, he got as far as the 6th clue. Only one is missing, the 7th city, and that city is London." Watson looked at Holmes in astonishment. "London? So the treasure is in London?" "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or the 7th clue is in London. According to Lord Ashworth's notes, the final clue would lead him to the treasure, and that clue is hidden somewhere in London." "Where?" Holmes took the last document. It was a letter, a note Lord Ashworth had written to himself. "The 7th clue is in the most secret place, a place no one would ever think of, but a place everyone knows. When time stands still, the truth appears." What does that mean? I must think. "When time stands still, the truth appears," Watson repeated. "It's a riddle." "Yes," said Holmes. "Lord Ashworth's final puzzle for us. And if we solve this puzzle, we'll find the treasure." All day, Holmes and Watson examined the documents. Every note, every clue slowly formed a picture. The Lost Brotherhood was not just a myth, it was real. And the knowledge they guarded was powerful enough to change the world. By evening, Holmes looked out the window. The Seine River glistened in the light of the setting sun. Paris was beautiful, as always, but beneath that beauty, a danger lurked. "Watson," Holmes said slowly, "we return to London tomorrow, but we must be careful. If someone followed Lord Ashworth, they could follow us too." "I'm ready," said Watson. He checked his gun, making sure it was loaded. That night, in the hotel's silence, Holmes couldn't sleep. Hundreds of questions swirled in his mind. Who were the Lost Brotherhood? Why were they so important? And the treasure? What did the treasure hold? But the most important question, who killed Lord Ashworth? And why? Holmes knew he would find the answers. He always did. But this time he felt different. This time it wasn't just a murder. It was uncovering a secret from the depths of history. And Sherlock Holmes loved solving secrets. Early in the morning they left Paris. The train took them back to London. Holmes remained silent the entire journey, lost in thought. Watson, however, wondered what his friend was planning. When they returned to Baker Street, the sun was setting. Mrs. Hudson greeted them at the door. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, welcome back. How was your trip to Paris?" Interesting, Mrs. Hudson, said Holmes. Very interesting. When they went up to their rooms, Holmes put the trunk on the table and took out the documents again. Now, Watson, the real work begins. We must find the seventh clue. When time stands still, the truth appears. What could that mean? Watson thought. A clock? A stopped clock? Perhaps, said Holmes. But there are thousands of clocks in London. Which clock? Perhaps a place, said Watson. A place where time seems to have stopped. An old building, a museum. Holmes's eyes lit up. A museum! Watson, you're a genius! The British Museum, the place where history stands still. The past is on display there. Time is frozen there. But the museum is huge, said Watson. Where should we look? Holmes examined Lord Ashworth's notes again. Then he noticed something. On the last page, there was a small drawing. A symbol, a phoenix, but this time different. Its wings were spread, looking upward. There, Holmes exclaimed excitedly. This symbol. It must be in the Egyptian section. Lord Ashworth found his first clue in Egypt. Perhaps the last clue is also connected to Egypt. Let's go to the museum tomorrow, said Watson. But we must be careful. If they're following us... They are following us, Holmes said sharply. I'm sure of it. But without them knowing, we'll be following them too. The game is on, Watson. The game is on. The next morning, the fog over London was thicker than usual. Holmes and Watson ate their breakfast in silence. Mrs. Hudson's fresh bread and jam were perfect as always, but neither of them touched much of their food. Their minds were preoccupied with the task ahead. Sherlock, Watson finally said, this Lost Brotherhood, do you really believe it exists? I mean, 1,000-year-old organization. It sounds like a fairy tale. Holmes was looking out the window, holding his teacup. Watson, history is full of fairy tales. Temples, secret societies, lost treasures. But some are real. Lord Ashworth devoted the last 20 years of his life to this research. He was a serious man, not a dreamer. If he believed, there was a reason. So what could this treasure be? Asked Watson. Gold? Jewels? No, said Holmes firmly. Lord Ashworth was not interested in material wealth. He was a collector, but he was more interested in knowledge. This treasure, probably knowledge, lost knowledge, perhaps something humanity has forgotten. Watson frowned. Like what? Holmes shrugged. I don't know, but we'll find out. We're going to the British Museum today. But first, we need to make some preparations. An hour later, Holmes stood before him in a strange outfit, dressed as an old professor. Grey wig, glasses, slightly stooped posture. It even surprised Watson. Sherlock, I wouldn't recognize you, Watson said with a smile. That's the point, said Holmes. His voice changed too. Older, more tremulous. If anyone is following us, they shouldn't see Sherlock Holmes. They should see Professor Edmund Whitmore. And me? Asked Watson. You are Dr. James Morrison, the professor's assistant. We are researching ancient Egyptian history. Watson had always been amazed by Holmes's attention to detail. It wasn't just changing clothes, it was creating a whole character. And Holmes did it perfectly. The British Museum was in Bloomsbury. It was one of London's most magnificent buildings. Its neoclassical architecture and massive columns made one feel small. Holmes and Watson arrived at the museum early in the morning. It wasn't crowded yet. Inside, museum guards greeted them. Holmes spoke in his Professor Whitmore persona. Good morning, gentlemen. I'm Professor Whitmore from Oxford University. This is my assistant, Dr. Morrison. We'd like to examine your Egyptian collection for our research. One of the guards, an elderly man, looked friendly. Of course, Professor. The Egyptian section is on the second floor. I can show you around if you like. That's very kind of you, said Holmes. But we prefer to wander around on our own. You know, academics. We get caught up in the details. The guard smiled and ushered them inside. As they climbed the stairs, Watson surveyed his surroundings. The museum was like a mosaic of history. Artifacts from different eras filled every corner. Roman statues, Greek amphorae, Assyrian reliefs. The Egyptian section was a large hall. Soft light filtered in through the glass hanging from the ceiling. Mummies, papyri and statues were displayed in the showcases. Each artifact told a story thousands of years old. Holmes began examining the showcases one by one. Watson joined him, but he didn't know exactly what they were looking for. Sherlock, what exactly are we looking for? The phoenix symbol, Holmes said quietly. Like the one in Lord Ashworth's drawing, wings spread, looking upward. This symbol indicates the location of the seventh clue. Minutes passed, then hours. Holmes examined every display case, every artifact, every inscription. Watson was amazed by his friend's patience. Holmes never tired, never gave up. He noticed every detail. As noon approached, Holmes stopped in front of a display case. Inside was a small amulet, gold but tarnished. On it was a bird figure, a phoenix, and its wings were spread, looking upward. "This is it," Holmes whispered. "Watson, look, it's the same." Watson approached. Indeed, it was identical to the symbol Lord Ashworth had drawn. But this is an amulet. How could it be a clue? Holmes read the display case's label. Phoenix Amulet, Ptolemaic period from Alexandria. Source unknown. Donated by Lord Edmund Ashworth in 1903. Watson gasped. "Lord Ashworth donated this amulet." "Yes," said Holmes, his eyes sparkling. "And this is no coincidence. He placed the clue here. But the clue isn't the amulet itself. It must be something else." Holmes examined the display case more closely. Under the amulet was a small piece of paper. It was difficult to read through the glass of the display case, but Holmes's sharp eyes made out the writing. "When time stands still, the truth appears. As the sun sets, the shadow lengthens. At the end of the shadow, the door opens." "Another riddle," said Watson. "But what does it mean?" Holmes thought. "As the sun sets, the shadow lengthens. So, at a certain time in a certain place, something appears. A shadow. And that shadow points to the door." "Which door?" "The door to the treasure," said Holmes. "But first we need to examine this amulet more closely. Watson, let's consult the museum authorities. Perhaps we can obtain permission to examine this amulet." They went to the museum director's office. The director was a middle-aged, serious-looking man. His name was Sir Charles Pemberton. Holmes introduced himself as Professor Whitmore and made his request. "The Phoenix amulet?" said Sir Charles, frowning. "Yes, it's one of Lord Ashworth's donated pieces. It's very valuable. What kind of examination will you be conducting?" "We just want to take photographs and examine it in detail," said Holmes. "Our research is on religious symbols from the Ptolemaic period. This amulet is a unique example." Sir Charles hesitated. "We don't normally allow it, but since you're a professor from Oxford, I suppose we can make an exception. But please be careful. The artifact is very fragile." "Of course," said Holmes. "Thank you." A museum attendant removed the amulet from its display case and led them to a small examination room. The room was quiet and well lit. A white cloth was spread on the table. The attendant carefully placed the amulet on the cloth. "Here," he said. "I can give you half an hour. Is that enough?" "That's enough," said Holmes. "Thank you." After the attendant left, Holmes immediately got to work. He took a magnifying glass from his pocket and began examining the amulet. He noted every detail: the bird's feathers, the angle of its wings, the shape of its eyes. "Watson, look," said Holmes excitedly. "There are tiny letters in the bird's eyes, very small, almost invisible, but readable with my magnifying glass." Watson came closer and looked. Indeed, tiny letters were engraved in the phoenix's eyes. They looked like Latin, but some of the letters were different. "Tempus fugit, veritas manet," Holmes read. "Time flies, truth remains," an old Latin proverb. But it must have a special meaning here. Holmes turned the amulet over. There were letters on the back too. This time it was a longer text. "When the great clock strikes 12, the shadow points east. Step to the edge of the shadow. There, find the stone lion's foot. Step on it and enter." "The great clock," said Watson. "That must be Big Ben." Holmes smiled. "Yes, Watson, London's most famous clock. When it strikes 12. But is it noon or midnight?" "It must be noon," said Watson. "It says the shadow points east. If the sun is in the west, the shadow falls east. That would be noon." "Correct," said Holmes. "But which shadow? Big Ben's shadow?" "It could be," said Watson. "But it says, 'by my step.' So we have to take a certain number of steps." Holmes examined the amulet again. Then he noticed something. There were numbers on the phoenix's feet. Very small, but they were there. 123, said Holmes. 123 steps. "From where to where?" asked Watson. "From Big Ben to the east," said Holmes. "At noon, when the sun is directly overhead, the clock's shadow stretches eastward. We follow that shadow, take 123 steps, and that will lead us to the stone lion." "The stone lion," said Watson thoughtfully. "Are there stone lion statues around Westminster?" "Yes," said Holmes. "There are several lion statues in Parliament Square. But which one? That's part of the puzzle." The attendant returned. "Professor, your time is up." "Thank you," said Holmes, carefully placing the amulet on the table. "That was very helpful." As they left the museum, Holmes was still dressed as Professor Whitmore, but his steps were quicker. "Watson, we must be at Big Ben at noon today, the moment it strikes 12. It was only 11 o'clock. There was an hour to go. But Holmes didn't want to take any chances. They started walking towards Westminster. Along the way, Holmes kept checking his surroundings. "Watson, is anyone following us?" Watson looked behind him too. The streets were crowded. Hundreds of people were rushing to their work. "I'm not sure, but I have a feeling. It's as if eyes are on us." "I feel the same way," said Holmes. "We must be careful. Whoever it is, they're looking for the seventh clue too." When they arrived at Westminster, Big Ben rose before their eyes. The magnificent, enormous clock tower. Tourists and people taking photos all around it. But Holmes paid no attention to the tourists. He went right under the clock and waited. "What do we do now?" asked Watson. "We wait," said Holmes. "It's noon, and then we'll follow the shadow." The minutes passed slowly. Holmes watched the clock's hands. 11:30, 11:45, 11:50. Just then, Watson noticed something. In the crowd, a man watching them. Tall, thin, pale. The man Madame Beaumont had described. "Sherlock," whispered Watson. "To our left, the man in the grey coat. He's watching us." Holmes saw the man out of the corner of his eye. He didn't turn his head, but he followed his every move. I see him. Stay calm, Watson. He won't do anything yet. But be ready. The clock showed 11:59. Then, bong. The first chime sounded. Big Ben was announcing noon. Bong. The second chime. Holmes sprang into action immediately. The sun was directly overhead but had shifted slightly westward. Big Ben's shadow stretched eastward. Holmes started at the edge of the shadow and began pacing. Watson followed behind him. 1, 2, 3. Holmes moved forward with steady, quick steps. He passed through the crowd, paying no attention to the tourist groups. 20, 30, 40. Watson followed behind, but also kept an eye on the man in the grey coat. The man was following them. 80, 90, 100. Holmes had now entered Parliament Square. There were several statues in the square, lions, statesmen, historical figures. 110, 120, 123. Holmes stopped. Right in front of him was a bronze lion statue. But this was no ordinary lion. It sat on a stone pedestal, and the lower parts of the pedestals were made of marble and decorated with small lion figurines. "There," said Holmes, "stone lions, but which one's paw will we step on?" Watson walked around the statue. There were 4 small lions, each facing a different direction. "How will we know?" Holmes remembered the amulet. The phoenix was looking up. "The one looking up," he said. "The lion looking up." They looked carefully. 3 lions were looking down at the ground, but the 4th, the one facing north, was looking up at the sky. Holmes stepped on that lion's foot. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a click. Very faint, but they heard it. A piece of the pedestal shifted slightly. "Watson, help me," Holmes said quickly. Together they pushed the pedestal. The stone was heavy, but it moved. Beneath it, a dark passageway appeared. Stairs led down. "I can't believe it," said Watson. "A secret passageway right in the middle of Westminster." "Believe it, Watson," said Holmes. "The Lost Brotherhood did this centuries ago, and no one noticed. Come on, let's go down, quickly." But just then a voice was heard. "Stop." The man in the grey coat was beside them. He had a small pistol in his hand, but it wasn't obvious in the crowd. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice thick with an accent. "The treasure is mine." Holmes looked calmly at the man. "I don't know who you are, but—" "I am Alexander Volkov," said the man, "and I will finish Lord Ashworth's investigation. You were just an obstacle. Now move." Watson reached for his gun, but Holmes stopped him. "Mr. Volkov, if you kill us, you will never find the treasure, because the final clue is only in my mind." Volkov hesitated. His eyes were filled with doubt. "You're lying." "No," said Holmes. "The amulet was only a piece of the puzzle. The real clue is in Lord Ashworth's diary, and I know that diary by heart. You don't." Volkov looked angry, but he was also uncertain. Holmes seized the moment. With a quick movement, he grabbed the gun from Volkov's hand and turned it sideways. Watson came up behind him immediately and twisted Volkov's arm. The struggle lasted seconds, but Holmes's boxing and fighting skills prevailed. Volkov fell to the ground. The gun flew away. "Watson, rope!" Holmes shouted. Watson immediately pulled a rope from his pocket. He was always prepared. They tied Volkov up tightly. "You will regret this," Volkov growled. "This isn't over." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But for now you'll wait here. Watson, notify the police. I'm going down." "Alone?" Watson asked anxiously. "No," said Holmes. "You're coming too. Volkov won't escape before the police arrive. We tied him securely." The two entered the dark passageway. The stairs were made of stone and smelled damp. Down, down they went. Holmes took a small lantern from his pocket. He was always prepared. The end of the stairs opened into a long tunnel. The tunnel had stone walls and a low ceiling. The walls were covered with ancient writing, Latin, Greek, Arabic, alphabets they didn't recognize. "This is incredible," said Watson, trying to read the inscriptions by the lantern's light. "This tunnel must be centuries old, perhaps 1,000 years." "Yes," said Holmes. "The work of the Lost Brotherhood. They built this tunnel to protect the treasure, and no one discovered it for centuries." They walked through the tunnel. Their footsteps echoed off the walls. The air was cold and damp, but at the same time there was a strange sense of peace. It was as if they were in a place where time had stopped. A few minutes later, the tunnel widened and opened into a room. The room was large, almost like a hall. In the middle was a large stone table. On the table were 7 candles, but the candles were extinguished probably years ago. "7 candles," said Holmes. 7 cities, 7 clues. This is the Lost Brotherhood's final meeting place." On the walls of the room were 7 large inscriptions. Each was in a different language. Holmes examined each one. He recognized some: Latin, Greek, Arabic. He didn't recognize others, but guessed Sanskrit, Chinese, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. "Each language carries a message of wisdom," said Holmes. "Look, Watson, I'll read the Latin one. Scientia est lux, knowledge is light. Greek, gnosis esti dynamis, knowledge is power. Arabic, al-ilm nur, knowledge is light." "They all say the same thing," said Watson. "Knowledge is important." "Yes," said Holmes. "The Lost Brotherhood aimed to protect knowledge. But what knowledge?" At the end of the room was another door. This door was made of metal, with intricate patterns on it. Holmes approached the door and examined the patterns. 7 circles, interlocked. Each circle bore a symbol. "A lock mechanism," said Holmes. "But what's the code?" Watson examined the door. "Maybe the circles turn. We need to find the right combination." Holmes tried to recall Lord Ashworth's notes. In the diary there was something. 7 cities, he said suddenly. Each city, a symbol. Lord Ashworth had found a symbol in each city, and these symbols unlock the lock. "But how do we know the symbols?" asked Watson. "The diary," said Holmes. Lord Ashworth had recorded each city's symbol. I remember. The first city, Cairo, the Ankh symbol, life. The second city, Athens, the owl, wisdom. The third was Rome, the eagle, power. The fourth was Istanbul, the crescent, change. The fifth was Baghdad, the book, knowledge. The sixth was Delhi, the lotus, enlightenment. The seventh was London, the phoenix, rebirth. Holmes began turning the dials in the correct order. Ankh, owl, eagle, crescent, book, lotus, phoenix. Each time a symbol clicked into place, a click was heard. When the last symbol clicked into place, the door slowly opened. A soft light emanated from within. Holmes and Watson entered. Before them was a small but magnificent room. The walls were covered in gold leaf. On the ceiling, star patterns shimmered. But what truly caught their attention was what stood inside a glass sphere at the centre of the room. A book, an old, bound book. But not an ordinary book. Its pages were made of gold leaf, and on each page was a different inscription. "The Golden Book," whispered Holmes. "This is the treasure of the Lost Brotherhood." Watson held his breath. This can't be real. A book made of gold?" "Not just gold," said Holmes, approaching the glass sphere. "Look, Watson, the writing. This is a summary of all human history. Lost knowledge, forgotten wisdom, dangerous truths. The Lost Brotherhood has collected knowledge over the centuries and stored it in this book. Next to the glass sphere was a small plaque. It read, "Knowledge is light, but light can blind. This book holds humanity's greatest secrets. Only those who are ready may read it. If you are reading these lines, then you are ready. But beware, this knowledge can change the world. For good or for evil, the choice is yours." Holmes touched the glass sphere. The sphere opened with a soft sound. He took the book from inside. It was heavy, but his hands were shaking from excitement or fear he didn't even know himself. He opened the first page. The writing was in ancient Greek. Holmes began to read, his voice echoing in the room. This book carries knowledge that has existed since the beginning of time. Science, philosophy, art, religion, everything is here, but most importantly, the truth that humanity has forgotten is here. The truth is, knowledge is a gift. But like any gift, if not used correctly, it becomes a curse. Watson came over to Holmes. "Sherlock, what's in this book?" Holmes continued, turning the pages. Each page was a different subject. Ancient mathematical formulas, lost medical knowledge, philosophical texts, scientific theories. Some were things modern science had not yet discovered. "Watson," Holmes said excitedly, "this book is humanity's lost treasure. If this information is correct, the world will change. Medicine, science, technology, everything will advance." "But why did they hide it?" asked Watson. "If it's so valuable, why didn't they share it?" Holmes looked at the last pages of the book. There was a warning there. Knowledge is power, but power corrupts. We, the Lost Brotherhood, chose to hide this knowledge because humanity was not yet ready. Perhaps one day it will be. When that day comes, the right person will find this book and use it correctly. But if the wrong person finds it, it will cause disaster. Holmes closed the book. A look of deep thought crossed his face. "Watson, now I understand. That's why Lord Ashworth wanted it. He wanted to deliver this book into the right hands. But he was murdered, and now we bear that responsibility." "What shall we do?" asked Watson. "Shall we take the book?" Holmes was silent for a long time. Then he placed the book back in the glass sphere. "No, Watson, this book must remain here. The time is not yet right. Humanity is not yet ready for this knowledge. Perhaps in 100 years, perhaps in 1,000 years, but not now." "But Sherlock," said Watson in astonishment, "you've come this far. You've taken so many risks. Why give up now?" "I'm not giving up, Watson," said Holmes. "I'm just doing the right thing. This book is dangerous. In the wrong hands, it could destroy the world. We found it, but it's also our duty to protect it." He closed the glass sphere. The sphere glowed again with that soft light. Holmes walked toward the door of the room. "Come on, Watson, our time is up. We must hand Volkov over to the police." They returned from the tunnel. They climbed the stairs. Outside, the police had arrived. Volkov was still bound, but he was furious. "Where are you?" he shouted. "Did you find the treasure? Where is it?" Holmes didn't even look at him. He turned to the police. "This man is a suspect in Lord Ashworth's death. Please take him away and question him. I will report the details to you." The police took Volkov away. Holmes and Watson remained in the square. The sun had now shifted westward. The shadows were lengthening. "Sherlock," Watson said softly, "did we really do the right thing? Perhaps that book could have made the world a better place." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but perhaps it could have made it worse. Watson, knowledge is a tool. How it is used is what matters. And humanity does not yet know how to use that tool properly. Perhaps one day it will. Until then, the Golden Book is safe. That night, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fireplace and began to play his violin. Watson watched him. There was a peace on his friend's face, perhaps the peace of having made the right decision. "Watson," said Holmes, putting down his violin, "I learned something from this case. Sometimes protecting something is as important as finding it. We were the last guardians of the Lost Brotherhood, and perhaps that is our greatest achievement." Watson smiled. "Perhaps, Sherlock, perhaps." But they both knew the adventure wasn't over. Volkov wasn't alone. Others were searching for the Golden Book, and they would return sooner or later. But for now, London was peaceful, and Holmes loved peace. The next morning, the newspaper published a story about Lord Ashworth's death. Diplomat Lord Ashworth died of a heart attack. His funeral will be held next week at Westminster Cathedral. Holmes read the newspaper and shook his head. "That's the official statement, Watson. But the truth is much more complicated." "Was Volkov's statement taken?" asked Watson. "Yes," said Holmes. "But he didn't say much. He only admitted that he had been following Lord Ashworth and wanted to finish his investigation. He didn't say anything about the death, but I'm sure he was involved." "How did he kill him?" asked Watson. "Poison, most likely," said Holmes. "A slow-acting poison. Volkov must have approached Lord Ashworth in his final days. Perhaps he arranged a meeting. Perhaps he set a trap. And Lord Ashworth realized it. That's why he left his final bequest to Madame Beaumont." "Poor man," said Watson. "He dedicated his life to protecting a secret, and in the end, that secret killed him." "Yes," said Holmes. "But Watson, he died, but the secret lives on. The Golden Book is still there, and one day, when the time is right, the right person will find it." Days passed. Holmes and Watson returned to their normal lives. Cases came and went, but the story of the Lost Brotherhood remained in their minds. A week later, a letter arrived. It was from Madame Beaumont. She was writing from Normandy. "Dear Mr. Holmes, the news has reached me. You found Lord Ashworth's secret. Thank you. Now I can rest in peace. I am thinking of returning to my shop. I hope the danger has passed. I have one question. What happened to the treasure? Did you find it? If you did, what am I doing? Yours sincerely, Elodie Beaumont." Holmes replied, "Dear Madame Beaumont, we found the treasure, but we took it. It is in the safest place. It was Lord Ashworth's wish to protect it, and we respected his wishes. You can return to your shop. The danger has passed. But be careful. The world is a dangerous place. Thank you for the lavender. It brought me peace. Yours sincerely, Sherlock Holmes." He sent the letter. Then he looked out the window. London was bustling as usual. People were rushing to their jobs. But Holmes knew that every person had a secret, and some secrets deserve to be protected. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, "do you think the world will ever be ready for the Golden Book?" Watson thought. "I don't know, Sherlock, but I hope so, because that knowledge could truly help humanity." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but until that day, we will be the guardians, the last guardians of the Lost Brotherhood." And so the mystery was solved, but the secret remained. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson had saved the world once again, but this time, not everyone knew it. Sometimes the greatest achievements are the quiet ones. Days and weeks passed. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson seemed to have closed the case of the Lost Brotherhood. Volkov was in Scotland Yard's custody. The Golden Book was in a safe place. Lord Ashworth's legacy was protected, but Holmes felt uneasy. A feeling, an intuition. It was as if something was missing, as if the story was not yet over. One Friday evening he was sitting in his living room on Baker Street, playing the violin. The melody was melancholic, a passage from Brahms' sonata. Watson was reading the newspaper by the fireplace, but he kept glancing at Holmes. His friend's state was worrying. "Sherlock," Watson finally said, putting down the newspaper. "Something is troubling you. Is it still the case of the Lost Brotherhood?" Holmes put down his violin and walked to the window. Outside, the evening lights of London were shining. "Watson, have you ever solved a puzzle but felt that one piece was missing?" "What do you mean?" "Volkov," said Holmes. "He was following Lord Ashworth. He wanted the treasure, but why? Who was he working for? A man cannot uncover a 1,000-year-old secret on his own. There must be someone behind him. An organization, a group." Watson followed Holmes's logic. "You're right. But Volkov isn't talking. Scotland Yard is interrogating him, but he's not saying anything." "Exactly," said Holmes. "Because he's afraid. He's very afraid of someone. So much so that he finds staying in prison safer than betraying that person." Just then there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice was heard. "Mr. Holmes, you have a visitor. His name is Inspector Lestrade." "Send him in, Mrs. Hudson," said Holmes. Lestrade was an old acquaintance from Scotland Yard. They had worked on many cases together. Lestrade entered looking tense. He was a middle-aged, serious man. "Holmes, Watson, I apologize for disturbing you at this hour, but it's urgent." "Sit down, Lestrade," said Holmes. "What happened?" Lestrade sat down and took a deep breath. "Volkov has escaped." Holmes and Watson looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" asked Watson. "This morning," said Lestrade. "His cell was empty. The lock hadn't been forced. The window wasn't broken. It was as if he had slipped through the walls. The guards hadn't seen anything." Holmes sprang into action. "He must have had help from inside. Someone got him out. Where was his cell?" "Newgate Prison," said Lestrade. "The most secure section. But he still escaped." "Newgate," said Holmes thoughtfully. "An old, enormous prison. Hundreds of cells, labyrinthine, corridors. And probably secret passages, too." "Passages?" asked Lestrade. "Yes," said Holmes. "Newgate has been around for centuries. Throughout its history, prisoners have sought escape routes. Some have succeeded. Perhaps there are old tunnels, secret doors. And whoever helped Volkov escape used these passages." "But who?" asked Lestrade. "Who could pull off such an organized operation?" Holmes stood at the window. "That's the real question, Lestrade. Volkov was a pawn, but whoever is pulling his strings is much more powerful. And now they've taken him back, because Volkov knows their secrets, and they don't want those secrets revealed." "What should we do?" asked Watson. "We must investigate," said Holmes. "But this time, more carefully, because we are no longer dealing with just one man, but an organization, and they are watching us." Lestrade looked at Holmes with concern. "Are you saying they're watching you? Are you in danger?" "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But I'm used to danger. The important thing is to find Volkov and expose those behind him. Lestrade, can we go to Newgate? I want to examine his cell." "Of course," said Lestrade. "Let's go." The three of them went to Newgate Prison in the darkness of night. The prison was a gloomy place, High walls, iron doors, dark windows. Inside, the voices of the prisoners echoed. Volkov's cell was on the 4th floor. It was a small, cramped room. A bed, a table, a chair. The window was barred but small, too small for a person to fit through. Holmes carefully examined the cell. He checked the walls, looked under the bed, inspected the ceiling. Watson and Lestrade waited silently. Watching Holmes work was always fascinating. A few minutes later, Holmes noticed something. There was a small crack in the wall in the corner. It was very small, invisible to the naked eye, but Holmes's eyes saw everything. "Look, Watson," said Holmes. "This crack is new. It must have formed in the last few days." "But how?" He pressed the wall carefully. A clicking sound was heard. A section of the wall shifted slightly. Behind it, a narrow passageway appeared. "There's our answer," said Holmes. A secret passageway. Volkov was taken out through this passageway. Lestrade looked stunned. "That's impossible. This prisoner's been here for centuries. How did no one discover this passageway?" "Because," said Holmes, "this passageway wasn't newly built. It's old. Perhaps it was built during the prison's construction, to smuggle out death row inmates or for other reasons. And only a few people know about it. Those who kidnapped Volkov used this old knowledge." "Should we follow the passage?" asked Watson. Holmes looked into the passage. It was dark, narrow, dangerous. "Yes, but be careful. There could be traps." The three of them entered the passage. Holmes led the way, a lantern in his hand. The passage had stone walls and smelled damp. With each step, their footsteps echoed. The passageway continued for a long time. Then they reached a staircase. The stairs led down deep into the darkness. Holmes carefully descended the stairs. With each step, the stone surfaces creaked. At the bottom of the stairs was a large room. The room resembled an old cellar. Torches burned on the walls, meaning someone was still here, or had been here recently. "Be careful," Holmes whispered. "They could still be here." In the middle of the room was a table. On the table were maps, documents, writings. Holmes approached the table and examined the documents. Some were in Russian, Volkov's native language. Some were in English, some in French. "Look, Watson," said Holmes, picking up a document. "This is about the Lost Brotherhood, Volkov's research. But there's other information here too. Names, places, organizational structure." Watson looked over Holmes's shoulder. The document contained a diagram of an organization. At the top was a name, Magister. Below that were several other names: Volkov, Dmitri, Anastasia, Klaus. "Magister," said Holmes. "The leader, Volkov's boss. And this organization isn't just searching for the Lost Brotherhood. It has other business, ancient artifacts, secret information, lost treasures. All part of this Magister's collection." "Who is this Magister?" asked Lestrade. "I don't know," said Holmes. "But I will find out. I can glean clues from these documents." Just then a sound was heard. Footsteps approaching, fast, multiple. Holmes sprang into action. "Hide!" The three hid in corners of the room. Holmes behind a column, Watson in a dark corner, Lestrade by the door. The footsteps drew nearer. Then two men appeared. They were tall and armed. Their faces were covered with masks. They weren't talking, but their movements were coordinated, like professional soldiers. The men entered the room and checked the table. They noticed the documents were missing. One whispered something to the other. Then they began searching the room. Holmes signalled to Watson. Watson understood. The two moved simultaneously. Holmes jumped on one man and twisted his arm. Watson grabbed the other from behind. The struggle was fierce, but silent. The men were trained fighters, but so were Holmes and Watson. A few minutes later, both men were on the floor, unconscious. Lestrade tied them up. "Who are these people?" Holmes removed one of the men's masks. The face was unfamiliar. "I don't know, but we can question them." One of the men slowly began to wake up. He opened his eyes and saw Holmes. He looked at him in fear. You're Sherlock Holmes." "Yes," Holmes said calmly. "And who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just shook his head. Holmes leaned closer. "Listen to me. I don't want to hurt you. I just want information. Who is Magister?" The man was still silent, but there was fear in his eyes. Deep, dark fear. "Are you afraid of the Magister?" asked Holmes. "What will he do to you?" The man bit his lip. Then he began to speak slowly. "The Magister. He's a ghost. No one has ever seen him. But his power is everywhere. If I talk, I die." "If you don't talk, you'll rot in prison," Lestrade said harshly. But the man only smiled. It was a bitter smile. "Rotting in prison is better than the Magister's wrath." Holmes saw that the man was determined. He couldn't get any more information. But there were the documents. There might be clues in the documents. "Lestrade, take these men and put them in jail," said Holmes. "I'll examine these documents." "Alone?" asked Watson. "Sherlock, this could be dangerous. This organization could target you." "They already have," said Holmes. "Volkoff knew me. The Magister knows who I am. But I'm not afraid, Watson. If I'm afraid, I lose. And I don't like to lose." Lestrade took the men away. Holmes and Watson gathered the documents and returned to Baker Street. It was late at night, but Holmes didn't sleep. He sat down at the table and began examining the documents. The documents formed a picture, like a map. Magister's organization was spread across the globe. Europe, Asia, America. He had agents and partners everywhere, and they were all searching for ancient secrets, lost treasures. "Watson, look," said Holmes, showing him a document. "This is the Magister's plan. He's not just searching for the Lost Brotherhood. He's searching for other things too. The Knights Templar's treasure, the map of Atlantis, the Holy Grail, all legends, but the Magister believes they are real." "And the Lost Brotherhood?" asked Watson. "That was the first step," said Holmes. "The Golden Book is the first piece of information the Magister wants. But there are other pieces, and he wants to collect them all." "Why?" asked Watson. "What will he do with this information?" Holmes took a deep breath. "Power, Watson. Knowledge is power, and the Magister wants to control the world. With ancient knowledge, he can change the modern world. Technology, economics, politics, everything." "That's insane," said Watson. "Yes," said Holmes, "but it's a dangerous insanity, because the Magister isn't just a dreamer. He's organised, wealthy and ruthless, and we have to stop him." The next morning, Holmes and Watson went to Scotland Yard. They met with Lestrade. "Have the captured men spoken?" asked Holmes. "No," said Lestrade. "Both are silent. But we found something. One of them had a small piece of paper in his pocket. There was an address written on it." "Where is the address?" asked Holmes. "Whitechapel," said Lestrade. "An old warehouse. Abandoned." "Abandoned?" said Holmes doubtfully. "Or made to look that way. Watson, we must go there." "But it could be a trap," said Watson. "Probably," said Holmes. "But we have to go, because this is our only lead to the Magister. In the afternoon, Holmes and Watson went to Whitechapel. The neighbourhood was one of the poorest areas of London. Narrow streets, old buildings, dark corners. It was known as a den of crime and misery. The warehouse was at the end of the street. It was a large, 3-story building. Its windows were broken, its door half open. Inside, there was silence. Holmes carefully pushed the door open. They went inside. The warehouse was empty. There were only old boxes and broken furniture. But Holmes noticed something. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. Someone had been here recently. "Be careful, Watson," Holmes said in a low voice. "Someone is here." They walked through the warehouse. With every step, the wooden floor creaked. Holmes was examining his surroundings. His eyes were recording every detail. At the end of the first floor, there was a staircase. It led upstairs. Holmes climbed the stairs. They reached the second floor. Here, there was more light. Sunlight streamed in through the windows. In the middle of the room was a table. On the table was a letter. Holmes picked up the letter and read it. "Dear Mr. Holmes, it is a pleasure to meet you. For years I have admired your detective skills. You truly have an extraordinary intellect. But now I find you standing before me. I am Magister, and you are interfering with my work. You found the treasure of the Lost Brotherhood. Congratulations. But you did not give it to me. That was a mistake, because that treasure belongs to me. I am making you an offer. Give me the golden book. In return, I will leave you and your friend alone, if you refuse. Consider the consequences. After receiving this letter, let me know your decision. Tomorrow night at Tower Bridge at midnight. Come alone. Bring Dr. Watson with you, but no one else. I know you are a smart man, Mr. Holmes. I hope you make a wise decision. Sincerely, Magister." When Holmes finished the letter, he gave it to Watson. Watson read it and frowned. "It's a trap, Sherlock. If we go to Tower Bridge, they'll kill us." "Perhaps," said Holmes. "But perhaps not. Magister wants to talk to me. If he just wanted to kill me, he would have done so already. No, he wants something else." "What?" "The golden book," said Holmes. "But I won't give it to him. So we need another plan." That night, on Baker Street, Holmes and Watson strategized. "We'll go to Tower Bridge tomorrow night," said Holmes. "But we won't go alone. Lestrade and the police will be nearby, hidden, but ready." "Magister will notice the police," said Watson. "Probably," said Holmes. "But we have no other choice. We must confront Magister, because he won't stop. If he can't get the golden book, he'll try other ways, and sooner or later, he'll find us." "So where is the golden book?" asked Watson. "Is it really under the British Museum?" Holmes smiled. "No, Watson, that would be too obvious. I moved the book somewhere else, a safe place. Only I know where." "Where?" Watson asked curiously. "For now it's a secret," said Holmes. "Because if Magister catches us and interrogates you, you don't know. This protects both you and the book." Watson understood Holmes's logic, but was still worried. His friend was taking a huge risk. And this time, the enemy wasn't just one man, it was an entire organization. The next day, preparations were made. Lestrade assembled a team of elite police officers. They would be positioned in secret locations near Tower Bridge. Holmes and Watson, meanwhile, would wait for the Magister on the bridge. The sun set. London sparkled with the lights of night. Tower Bridge was a magnificent structure over the River Thames. 2 towers rose on either side of the bridge. In the middle, there was a mechanism that opened and closed for large ships to pass through. Close to midnight, Holmes and Watson arrived at the bridge. It was a cold night. The wind was blowing. The river stretched out like a black ribbon in the moonlight. "Are you ready, Watson?" asked Holmes. "I'm ready," said Watson. His gun was in his pocket, the safety off. Midnight came. Big Ben struck 12 times. Then, silence. Holmes and Watson waited. Minutes passed. Then, a sound was heard. Footsteps. From the darkness, a figure appeared. A tall man in a black coat. His face was in shadow, but his gait was confident. Several other men were with him. All were armed. "Mr. Holmes," said the figure, his voice deep and soft. "You've come. How kind of you." "Magister, I presume," said Holmes calmly. "We finally meet." The figure stepped forward. The moonlight illuminated his face. He was a handsome, middle-aged man. His eyes were sharp, his hair silver. But his most striking feature was his smile, a cold, calculated smile. "Yes, Mr. Holmes," said the Magister. "We finally meet. I've been watching you for years. Your achievements have impressed me. You are a true genius." "Thank you for the compliment," said Holmes. "But now, let's get down to business. You want the Golden Book. Why?" Magister leaned against the railing of the bridge. "Because, Mr. Holmes, that book will change the future of humanity. The knowledge within it will carry the world into a new era. And I want to be the pioneer of that era." "A pioneer or a dictator?" asked Holmes. Magister laughed. "Is there a difference?" "Throughout history, great leaders have always controlled knowledge. Knowledge is power, and power rules the world. But that power is dangerous in the wrong hands," said Holmes. "The Lost Brotherhood had reasons to hide the Golden Book. Knowledge is not always used for good." "Ah, the classic moral lesson," said the Magister sarcastically. "Mr. Holmes, you are an idealist. But the world is not for idealists. The world is for pragmatists. I am a pragmatist." "And I will not give it to you," said Holmes firmly. Magister's smile vanished. His face hardened. "Mr. Holmes, this is not wise. My resources are unlimited. My men are everywhere. You are just one man. If you resist, you will lose." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but I will try." Magister shook his head. Then he signalled to his men. They drew their guns. Watson immediately pulled out his pistol. "Do you really want to shoot?" asked Holmes. "Here in the middle of London. The police are already on their way." Magister looked around. At both ends of the bridge, police appeared. Led by Lestrade, the circle was closing in. "A trap," said Magister, but his voice was still calm. "Clever, Mr. Holmes, but I am prepared." Magister took a small whistle from his pocket and blew it. The sound was sharp and loud. Suddenly, a boat appeared from the river. It was fast with a powerful motor. The boat came under the bridge. "Goodbye, Mr. Holmes," said Magister. "But this isn't our last meeting. Next time I'll be better prepared." Magister and his men jumped from the bridge railing. Below, the boat was waiting. They fell, but landed safely on the boat. The boat sped away. Lestrade and the policeman ran to the bridge. "They've escaped!" shouted Lestrade. "There's a boat on the river." "Follow them," said Holmes. "But be careful. They're armed." The policemen ran to the riverbank. Some got into boats and began to follow Magister. But Magister's boat was very fast. In the darkness of the night, it disappeared on the Thames River. Holmes remained on the bridge and looked at the river. Watson came up beside him. "He got away, Sherlock. What shall we do?" "We'll wait," said Holmes. "Magister will come back, because he still wants the Golden Book, and he's not one to give up." "But now he knows us," said Watson. "He'll target us." "Yes," said Holmes. "But I know him now too. I've seen his face, heard his voice, and I'll stop him, Watson, whatever the cost." That night, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes stared out the window for a long time. London was asleep, but he couldn't sleep. In his mind, Magister's face kept turning. This man was dangerous, intelligent, organised, ruthless, and he would do anything to get the Golden Book. But Holmes wouldn't let him. Because the Golden Book wasn't just a treasure. It was the future of humanity. And that future should not be in the hands of someone like Magister. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "the war has begun, and we must win." Watson stood beside his friend. "We will win, Sherlock. Together." And so the two friends prepared to fight the enemy lurking in the shadows. They knew it would be a long and dangerous war, but they would not give up, because some battles had to be won. For weeks, Holmes and Watson tracked Magister, but the man was like a ghost. Each time he was one step ahead. Every clue led to a dead end. Scotland Yard's entire resources were used, but Magister could not be found. One November morning, the fog was particularly thick on Baker Street. Holmes stood at the window, playing his violin. This time the melody was different, a passage from Mozart's Requiem. Melancholic, sorrowful, yet powerful. Watson was writing his correspondence, but his mind was always on the Magister case. "Sherlock," he said finally, "maybe we should try a different approach. Instead of finding Magister, let's lure him into a trap." Holmes put down his violin and turned to Watson. "What kind of trap?" "The Golden Book," said Watson. "He wants the book. If he thinks he can find out where it is, he might come." Holmes thought, "An interesting idea, Watson, but risky. If Magister really finds out where the book is, we'll cause a disaster." "But we can give him a fake location," said Watson. "Misinformation. And when Magister comes, we'll be ready." Holmes smiled. "Watson, you've secretly become a strategist. It's a good idea, but we must plan carefully. Magister is no fool. We can't fool him easily." Just then there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's voice was heard. "Mr. Holmes, a telegram has arrived for you. It's said to be urgent." Holmes took the telegram and read it. His face suddenly changed, a mixture of shock and concern. "Watson, it's from Paris, from Madame Beaumont." "What's happened?" Watson asked anxiously. Holmes read the telegram aloud. "Urgent. My shop has been broken into. Everything is in disarray. Someone is looking for me. I am afraid. Please help. A.B." "Damn it," said Watson. "Magister has targeted her too." "It seems so," said Holmes. "We must go to Paris. Immediately. Madame Beaumont is in danger." Within an hour they had made their preparations. The train was leaving in the afternoon. But Holmes wanted to do one more thing. He went to Scotland Yard and spoke with Lestrade. "Lestrade, I'm going to Paris," said Holmes. "Madame Beaumont is in danger, but you must be careful in London too. Magister may take advantage of this opportunity." "I understand," said Lestrade. "I'll keep an eye on Baker Street. But be careful, Holmes. Paris is not within our jurisdiction." "I know," said Holmes. "But Madame Beaumont's safety is important. She is a key witness in the Lost Brotherhood case." The afternoon train took them back to Paris. This time the journey was gloomier than the first. Holmes was silent as he looked out the window. Watson knew his friend was worried. "Sherlock," said Watson, "will protect Madame Beaumont. Don't worry." "I hope so, Watson," said Holmes. "But Magister is ruthless. If he knows Madame Beaumont helped me, he'll try to use her." They arrived in Paris at night. They went straight to the Marais district. Rue des Rosiers was quiet and dark as usual. But the flower shop had its window smashed and its door forced open. Inside, everything was in disarray. Holmes and Watson entered cautiously. Flowers were strewn on the floor, vases were broken, shelves were overturned. Someone had conducted a thorough search here. "Madame Beaumont," called Holmes. "Are you here?" There was no answer. Holmes moved further into the shop. He looked in the back room, the kitchen. It was empty. Then he went down to the basement. No one was there either. But he noticed something. In the basement, some boxes had been opened, their contents rummaged through. "Someone was looking for the valuables," said Holmes. "They were probably looking for Lord Ashworth's box, but we had taken it." "Then where is Madame Beaumont?" asked Watson. Holmes examined the shop again. Then he noticed a small note on the table. It smelled of lavender. Madame Beaumont's signature. "Mr. Holmes, I can't wait to see you. It's too dangerous. I'm going to my sister's, to Normandy. But I must tell you something. The man who came looking for me seemed familiar. Years ago, he came to my shop a few times. His name, I don't quite remember. But I do remember one thing. He had blue eyes, very pale blue, and he wore a ring, a phoenix symbol. Does that mean anything to you? Be careful, Mr. Holmes. E.B." Holmes finished the note and handed it to Watson. The phoenix symbol. This can't be a coincidence, Watson. The Magister's organisation uses the phoenix symbol. The seal on Lord Ashworth's letter was also a phoenix. "So Magister's man was here years ago," said Watson. "But why? The Lost Brotherhood case hadn't even begun then." "No, Watson," said Holmes slowly. "Perhaps the case began much earlier than we thought. Perhaps Magister had been watching Lord Ashworth for years. Perhaps he was watching Madame Beaumont too." As they exited through the back door of the shop, Holmes noticed something. On the wall, a small symbol had been drawn, in chalk, white. A phoenix. But this phoenix was different. Its wings were pointing down, its tail up. "A message," said Holmes. "The Magister has left us a message. An inverted phoenix. What could that mean?" Watson pondered. "Death? The opposite of rebirth?" "Perhaps," said Holmes. "Or a warning. Beware, the fall is near, as it were." They notified the Paris police. But Holmes wasn't very hopeful. Magister was probably influential in France too. Escaping the police would not be difficult for him. That night, they stayed at a small hotel. Holmes spent the night sleepless. Hundreds of questions swirled in his mind. Who was the Magister? Why was he so obsessed with the Lost Brotherhood and the phoenix symbol? It must have a deeper meaning. Early in the morning, he made a decision. "Watson, we're going to Normandy. We must find Madame Beaumont. Perhaps she has more information." Normandy was north of Paris. Green hills, farms, small villages. Madame Beaumont's sister lived in the town of Étretat. It was a place famous for its white cliffs on the coast. They arrived in the town in the afternoon. The sister's farm was outside the town. It was a small stone house surrounded by lavender fields. An elderly woman opened the door. She resembled Madame Beaumont, but looked older. "Yes?" "I'm Sherlock Holmes," said Holmes. "We're looking for Madame Elodie Beaumont. I believe she's here." The woman's face tensed. You're that detective. Elodie mentioned you. Come in." The interior looked warm and inviting. A fire was burning in the fireplace, and the scent of lavender filled the air. Madame Beaumont was sitting in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hand. She stood up when she saw Holmes. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, you've come." She looked relieved but also anxious. Madame Beaumont, Holmes said gently. Are you all right? I'm fine, said the woman, but I was scared. That man was very dangerous. Tell us about him, said Holmes. Remember every detail. Madame Beaumont sat down and began to tell her story. 3 days ago, in the evening, he came to my shop. He was tall, thin, with blue eyes, very light blue, almost icy. He had a ring, a phoenix symbol. Madame Beaumont, he said, I used to come here years ago. Do you remember me? I did remember, continued Madame Beaumont. Yes, he had come several times years ago. Each time he bought lavender, but now he seemed different. Colder, more dangerous. What did he want? Asked Holmes. Lord Ashworth's trust, said Madame Beaumont. He knew everything. You took the chest, he said. You gave it to Sherlock Holmes, but that chest belongs to me, and I want it back. I said, the chest is gone. I can't give it to you. Then he became angry. He started searching the shop, turning everything upside down. Then what happened? Asked Watson. I fled, said Madame Beaumont. I went out the back door and took the train here. But the fear is still inside me, Holmes thought. Madame Beaumont, did that man tell you his name, or where he came from? No, said Madame Beaumont. But he said one thing. Magister sent me, and Magister always gets what he wants. That's when I realized this wasn't just a thief. He was part of an organization. Magister, said Holmes. Yes, you understood correctly. This man works under the orders of the head of a dangerous organization. Madame Beaumont's sister brought tea. Mr. Holmes, said the woman, is my sister safe here? For now, yes, said Holmes. But in the long run, it might be safer for her to come to London, under my protection. To London, said Madame Beaumont, astonished. But my life is in Paris. I understand, Madame, said Holmes. But Magister may want to use you, against me. If you are in London, under my supervision, you will be safe. Madame Beaumont hesitated, but in the end she agreed. All right, Mr. Holmes, I trust you. The next day, the three of them returned to London together. Madame Beaumont settled into a small boarding house near Baker Street. Holmes knew it was run by a friend of Mrs. Hudson's. It was safe and under surveillance. After returning to London, Holmes began intensive research. He wanted to learn everything about the phoenix symbol. He spent hours in the British Museum library, poring over old books and researching mythology. One day, in an old book on Greek mythology, he found an interesting passage. The phoenix is not only a symbol of rebirth, it is also the guardian of secret knowledge. In ancient times, some communities used the phoenix symbol, communities that protected knowledge. They were called the Phoenix Brotherhood. Holmes eagerly turned the pages. There was more information. The Phoenix Brotherhood was also known as the Lost Brotherhood, 7 members in 7 cities, each member a guardian of knowledge. But over time, the Brotherhood split. Some wanted to share the knowledge. Some wanted to keep it hidden. Conflict began, and eventually the Brotherhood disintegrated. There it is, Holmes exclaimed loudly. The other people in the library looked at him. Holmes apologized and continued reading. From the disintegrated Brotherhood, 2 groups emerged. The first, the Guardians of Light, who hid the knowledge to protect it. The second, the Shadow Hunters, who sought to seize the knowledge. These 2 groups fought for centuries, and the war continues to this day. Holmes closed the book. Everything now made sense. The Lost Brotherhood was not just a legend, it was real history. And now, both groups still existed. Lord Ashworth was probably one of the Lightkeepers, and the Magister. The Magister was the leader of the Shadow Hunters. When he returned to Baker Street, he found Watson. "Watson, I've discovered it. Everything makes sense now." Holmes explained what he had found. Watson listened in astonishment. "So, this isn't just a treasure hunt. It's a centuries-old war." "Yes," said Holmes. "The Light Guardians and the Shadow Hunters. Two groups fighting over the same treasure, but for different reasons. One to protect it, the other to use it." "So which side are we on?" Watson asked. "The Lightkeeper's side," Holmes said. "Lord Ashworth chose us. He trusted us, and we will protect the Golden Book." But just then, Mrs. Hudson hurried upstairs. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, there's someone downstairs. He wants to see you. He's very insistent." "Who?" asked Holmes. "I don't know," said Mrs. Hudson. "But he's a strange man, old but energetic, and he said something. 'I come from the Lightkeepers.'" Holmes and Watson immediately went downstairs. At the door stood an old man. He had a long white beard and deep wrinkles, but his eyes were young and lively. In his hand was a cane on which was a phoenix symbol. "Mr. Holmes," said the man, his voice old but strong. "We finally meet. I am the last member of the Lightkeepers. My name is Professor Marcus Aldwyn." Holmes invited the man inside. They went into the living room. Professor Aldwyn sat down and took a deep breath. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "I have much to tell you. But first, there is something you must know. Lord Ashworth was a traitor." Holmes and Watson looked at him in shock. "What?" said Watson. "Lord Ashworth, a traitor? But he protected the Golden Book." "No," said Professor Aldwyn sadly. "He didn't give you the Golden Book because he wanted to protect it. He gave it to you because he couldn't give it to the Magister. Lord Ashworth was a member of the Guardians of Light for many years. But in his later years, the Magister deceived him. He promised him power, wealth. And Lord Ashworth considered betraying them. But then he died," Holmes said slowly. "Yes," said Professor Aldwyn, "because the Magister didn't trust him. He knew Lord Ashworth would betray him. But he also knew Lord Ashworth could give you the Golden Book, so he killed him. But it was too late. The book was already in your hands." Holmes tried to digest all this. Was Lord Ashworth a traitor, or was this just one man's weakness? "Professor," said Holmes, "if Lord Ashworth was a traitor, why did he trust me? Why did he entrust the Golden Book to me?" "Because," said Professor Aldwyn, "at the last moment he regretted it. A few days before his death he met with me. 'Marcus,' he said, 'I made a terrible mistake. I trusted the Magister, but he used me. Now he wants to get his hands on the Golden Book. I can't stop him, but Sherlock Holmes can. That's why he entrusted the book to you.'" Watson was still stunned. "But Madame Beaumont, she said Lord Ashworth was a good man." "Madame Beaumont didn't know everything," said Professor Aldwyn. "Lord Ashworth only showed her his good side, but he had a dark side, human weakness. We all have it." Holmes stood up and went to the window. Outside, London life continued, but inside, Holmes's world had been shaken. Was Lord Ashworth a traitor, or just a victim? "Professor Aldwyn," said Holmes, "how many members of the Lightkeepers are left?" "Only me," said Professor Aldwyn sadly. "The others died over the years, some of natural causes, some under suspicious circumstances. The Magister systematically eliminated us. Now, only I remain, and you." "Us?" said Watson. "Yes," said Professor Aldwyn. Lord Ashworth chose you. That means you are now part of the Light Keepers. Protecting the Golden Book is your duty. Holmes turned to the professor. So how do we stop the Magister? I don't know, said Professor Aldwyn. The Magister has existed for centuries. Perhaps not the same person, but the same position. The Shadow Hunters have always had a Magister, and each Magister has been more powerful, more dangerous than the last. But there must be a weakness, said Holmes. Every system has a weakness. Professor Aldwyn smiled. A wise word, Mr. Holmes. Yes, every system has a weakness, and the Magister's weakness is pride. He believes himself invincible. That is his Achilles' heel. That night they talked at length. Professor Aldwyn recounted the history of the Light Keepers, explained the tactics of the Shadow Hunters, and elucidated the true importance of the Golden Book. The Golden Book, said the professor, doesn't just contain ancient knowledge. It also contains the future. Written within it are the discoveries humanity will make, the dangers it will face, the decisions it will take. The Lost Brotherhood didn't just record the past, it also foresaw the future. How? Asked Watson in astonishment. We don't know, said Professor Aldwyn. But the sages of the Lost Brotherhood possessed incredible abilities. Perhaps mathematics, perhaps philosophy, perhaps something else. But they could predict the future, and those predictions are in the Golden Book. Holmes grew concerned upon hearing this. If the Magister gets his hands on this book, he could change the future, said Professor Aldwyn. For the worse, the Magister could shape the world according to his own vision, and that vision is dark. The next morning, Professor Aldwyn left. But before he went, he gave Holmes something. A small medallion. It had a phoenix symbol on it. This, said the professor, is the symbol of the Guardians of Light. It is now yours. Wear it. It will protect you. And remember, light always conquers darkness, but it requires struggle. Holmes took the medallion and hung it around his neck. He could feel it. Cold metal, yet also warm, as if there was energy within it. Days passed. Holmes and Watson waited for the Magister's next move. But it didn't seem to be coming. The silence was unsettling. One evening, Holmes was playing his violin while Watson read the newspaper. Then Watson saw something. A small news item on the last pages of the paper. Professor Marcus Aldwyn found dead at his home. Suspected heart attack. Funeral tomorrow. Watson froze. Sherlock. Holmes put down his violin and picked up the newspaper. He read it. His face darkened. Magister. But how? Said Watson. The professor was healthy. He was here just a few days ago. Poison, said Holmes. Like Lord Ashworth. The Magister has killed the last member of the Guardians of Light. Now only we remain. Watson looked at Holmes with concern. Sherlock, maybe we should give up the Golden Book. This war seems unwinnable. No, Watson, said Holmes firmly. Never. The Light Guardians have fought for centuries. We cannot give up now. Professor Aldwyn's death will not be in vain. I will stop the Magister, whatever the cost. That night, Holmes and Watson devised a new strategy. They would no longer remain on the defensive. They would go on the offensive. Find the Magister, expose him, defeat him. The war had entered a new phase. And this time, Holmes was determined to win. Because this wasn't just a case. This was humanity's future. It was a cold December morning. The fog settling over London seemed thicker than usual. It was as if the city had been hidden under a giant blanket. Holmes stood in front of the window on Baker Street, lost in thought. In his hand was the medallion given to him by Professor Aldwyn, the phoenix symbol spinning between his fingers. Watson sat by the fireplace, staring into the fire. There was a silence between them, but it was a comfortable silence. Having been together for years, sometimes they didn't even need to speak. "Watson," Holmes said finally, his voice thoughtful. "What do you think courage is?" Watson looked at his friend in surprise. Holmes rarely asked such philosophical questions. "Courage? I suppose it's overcoming fear, or doing what's right despite fear." "A good definition," said Holmes. He continued to look out the window. "I thought I was brave for years, but now I understand that real courage is something else. Real courage is knowing you might lose, but fighting anyway." Watson stood up and came over to Holmes. "Sherlock, you won't lose. We won't lose. We've overcome every challenge so far." Holmes turned to Watson for the first time and smiled, but his smile was sad. "This time is different, Watson. The Magister isn't just an enemy. He's a system, an ideology. Defeating systems is harder than defeating people." Just then there was a violent knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson's anxious voice could be heard. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, the police are here. Inspector, Lestrade says it's very urgent." Holmes and Watson immediately went downstairs. Lestrade was standing at the door, out of breath. His face was sweaty, his eyes anxious. "Holmes, Watson, you must come immediately. There's a situation at the British Museum. It's very serious." "What happened?" asked Holmes, putting on his coat immediately. "I don't know exactly," said Lestrade, "but the museum director, Sir Charles Pemberton, is calling for you urgently. Something has happened in the Egyptian section, and someone has been murdered." The three of them immediately got into a car and set off for the British Museum. On the way, Lestrade gave more details. "Early this morning, an employee found a body in the Egyptian section. The man had been murdered, stabbed. And the strange thing is, the body was found inside a display case." "Inside a display case?" Watson said in astonishment. "How did he get in there?" "That's the mystery," said Lestrade. "The display case wasn't broken or forced open. It was as if the man had been locked in from the inside." Holmes listened quietly, but in his mind, the wheels were turning. The British Museum, the Egyptian section, the display case, and the Phoenix amulet. Everything was connected. When they arrived at the museum, police tape was everywhere. Sir Charles Pemberton was waiting at the entrance. His face was pale. His hands were shaking. "Mr. Holmes, something terrible has happened. Please come inside." They went to the Egyptian section. Police had gathered around the display case. Inside was a body. A tall, thin man. He had a stab wound in his chest. But the strangest thing was the expression on the man's face. A mixture of fear and bewilderment, as if he hadn't been expecting death. Holmes looked closely at the display case. "How does the display case open?" "From the back," said Sir Charles, "with a special key. There are only 3 keys, one with me, one with the Chief Inspector, and one with the Security Chief. All 3 are accounted for. We checked." "So someone else has a key," said Holmes. "Or there's a way to open it without a key." Holmes carefully examined the display case. He checked every corner, every joint. Then he noticed something small underneath. A very small, almost invisible mechanism. When he pressed it, the back panel of the display case opened slightly. "There," said Holmes. "A hidden mechanism. The work of the Lost Brotherhood. They designed this display case specifically. Only the right person could find this mechanism." "But "Who is the body?" asked Watson. Holmes looked in the body's pockets. He found an ID card. Name, Victor Dmitriev. Holmes recognized the name. This was one of Volkov's associates from Magister's organization. "So one of Magister's men was killed here," said Lestrade. "But who killed him?" Holmes examined the body. The knife was still in his chest. It was a special knife, an antique bronze, with writing on it. Holmes examined the writing. Ancient Greek. "Light conquers darkness," Holmes read. "The motto of the Guardians of Light." So one of the Guardians of Light did this. But who? Professor Aldwyn is dead. Who else could it be? Just then, Holmes noticed something. Next to the body was a small piece of paper. On it was a message. "Mr. Holmes, Victor Dmitriev was one of Magister's most loyal men. He came here to steal the Golden Book, but I stopped him. Yes, me. I wasn't the last member of the Guardians of Light. There is someone else, and that someone is not you. This war is much more complex than you think. The Light Guardians and the Shadow Hunters are not the only two sides. There is a third power, and that power wants to destroy both of them. Be careful, Mr. Holmes. The people you trust may be your enemies. No signature." Holmes finished the letter and handed it to Watson. Watson read it and frowned. "A third force? What does that mean?" "I don't know," said Holmes. "But someone is changing the game. The person who killed Victor says they are from the Light Keepers. But who?" Lestrade checked the area. "Mr. Holmes, are there any other clues here?" Holmes examined the inside and outside of the display case once more. Then he noticed a small symbol on the wall next to the display case. It was drawn in chalk, white. But this time it wasn't a phoenix. It was a different symbol, 3 circles intertwined. In the center, an eye. "This symbol," Holmes said thoughtfully. "I haven't seen it before, but it carries meaning. 3 circles, perhaps 3 powers. The Guardians of Light, the Hunters of Shadow, and a third power." "And the eye?" asked Watson. "Surveillance," said Holmes. "Or knowledge, the all-seeing eye." Sir Charles looked at Holmes with concern. "Mr. Holmes, what is going on in this museum? First you come and examine the Phoenix amulet, then a man is murdered. Are these cases connected?" "Yes," Holmes said honestly. "They are connected. But Sir Charles, I cannot tell you the details, because the information would put you in danger. Just know this. This museum protects something very important, and some people will do anything to get it." "The Phoenix amulet?" asked Sir Charles. "No," said Holmes. "But the amulet was a clue to something bigger, and now that clue is in danger." Holmes went to the display case where the amulet was kept. The amulet was still there, safe and shining. But Holmes noticed something. The paper beneath the amulet, the riddle he had read earlier, had changed. Now there was a different message. "The game has changed, Holmes. There are no longer just 2 sides. A third party is watching everything, and they will win. Can you protect the Golden Book, or will it be lost? Time will tell. But know this. Every choice has a price, and sometimes the right choice is to do nothing. Think, Holmes. Think carefully." Holmes read the message and felt a sense of unease. Who was this third power? And what did it want? Things were getting more complicated. That evening, when they returned to Baker Street, Holmes and Watson had a long discussion. "Sherlock," said Watson, "perhaps this third force is actually trying to help. By killing Victor, he thwarted the Magister's plan." "Perhaps," said Holmes, "but perhaps he has his own plan." "Watson, In power games, the enemy's enemy is not always your friend. Sometimes it's a third enemy. Later that night, a visitor arrived. Madame Beaumont. Her face was worried. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I need to tell you something. I've learned something terrible." "What have you learned, madame?" asked Holmes. "Today I received a letter from an old friend," said Madame Beaumont. "From Paris. He knew Lord Ashworth well, and he told me something. Lord Ashworth, before he died, made a confession. He told my friend, 'Tell Elodie to forgive me. I put her in danger because I trusted Magister. But now I regret it.'" "A confession," said Watson. "So Professor Aldwyn was right. Lord Ashworth really did consider betrayal." "But he changed his mind at the last moment," said Holmes, "and that's why he was killed. Magister no longer trusted him." Madame Beaumont began to cry. "I wanted to remember Lord Ashworth as a good man. But now I don't know what to think." Holmes gently touched Madame Beaumont's shoulder. "Madame, humans are complex beings. Lord Ashworth had both good and bad sides, but what matters is his final choice. He did the right thing. He entrusted the Golden Book to you and me. That was his salvation." Madame Beaumont wiped her tears. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. You always manage to see the good in people." That night, after Madame Beaumont left, Holmes went to the window. Outside, it had started snowing. London was covered in a white blanket. It was beautiful, peaceful. But in Holmes's mind, there was a storm. "Watson," Holmes said slowly, "tomorrow I will make a decision about the future of the Golden Book." "What kind of decision?" asked Watson. "Where I will hide it," said Holmes, "because this war cannot go on forever. Somewhere there must be a definite end, and that end must be the protection of the Golden Book." The next morning, Holmes got up early. Without waking Watson, he quietly left the house. He had a small bag in his hand. Inside was the Golden Book. Yes, the book had been kept in Holmes's private safe on Baker Street until now. But now it had to be moved to a safer place. Holmes walked through the streets of London. Snow covered everything. Footprints disappeared on the white ground, as if they had never been there. After an hour's walk, he arrived at an old church. It was near St. Paul's Cathedral. It looked small and abandoned, but Holmes knew this was just an appearance. The church was an old hideout of the Guardians of Light. He went inside. The church was dark and silent. The pews were empty. The altar looked dusty. But Holmes went behind the altar and found a hidden mechanism. When he pressed it, a panel opened. Underneath was a narrow staircase, leading down. He descended the stairs. The basement had stone walls. In the middle was a large stone chest. A phoenix symbol was carved on it. Holmes opened the chest. Inside were old documents, books, artifacts, all entrusted to the Guardians of Light. Holmes placed the Golden Book in the chest. He placed it carefully among the other artifacts. Then he closed the chest. There was a lock, a special lock. It could only be opened with the Phoenix medallion. Holmes inserted the medallion into the lock and turned it. The chest locked. "You are safe now," Holmes whispered, "and I will protect you." As he left the church, he saw a figure in front of him. It was hard to recognize in the darkness, but as he approached, the face became clear. It was the Magister. "Mr. Holmes," said the Magister, his voice calm but threatening. "What a coincidence. I was here too." Holmes put down his bag and turned to the Magister. "You followed me?" "Of course," said the Magister. "You went to hide the Golden Book. and I wanted to find out where you hid it." "Did you find out?" asked Holmes. The Magister smiled. "Yes, the old church near St. Paul's, the old hiding place of the light keepers. A wise choice, but still, I found it." "You found it," said Holmes, "but you can't take it. The chest is protected by a special lock, and I have the key." Magister looked at the medallion around Holmes's neck. "The Phoenix medallion. Yes, I know. But Mr. Holmes, you will give me that medallion." "Why should I?" asked Holmes. "Because," said the Magister, pulling a gun from his pocket, "otherwise I'll kill you, and then I'll take the medallion from your corpse." Holmes looked at the gun, but he didn't seem afraid. "Magister, if you kill me, the medallion will be useless, because the medallion only activates when I wear it. Professor Aldwin made it especially for me. If someone else wears it, they can't open the lock." Magister hesitated. "You're lying." "Try it," said Holmes calmly. "Kill me and take the medallion. Then when the lock won't open for you, what will you do?" Magister looked angry, but at the same time he understood Holmes's logic. "So what do you suggest?" "A deal," said Holmes. "You leave me and my friends alone. I'll keep the Golden Book hidden here forever. No one can take it. No one can read it." "But that's unacceptable," said the Magister. "The Golden Book is important for humanity's future." "Yes," said Holmes, "but that future cannot be in your hands. You would misuse that knowledge. That's why the book will stay here, maybe in 100 years, maybe in 1,000 years when humanity is ready. Someone will come and take it. But not now." Magister was silent for a long time. Then he lowered his weapon. "Mr. Holmes, you are an interesting man, an idealist but a pragmatist, intelligent but also capable of showing mercy. I don't want to kill you, but I don't want to lose this war either." "The war is over," said Holmes. "The Golden Book is now inaccessible. You can kill me, but that won't give you the book. It will only give you another enemy. Dr. Watson, Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. They will seek revenge," Magister thought. Then he smiled. "A clever move, Mr. Holmes. You've cornered me. I accept. A temporary truce. You and your friends are safe. But know this. This truce won't last forever. One day a new Magister will come, and he may break your protection, perhaps," said Holmes. "But by then I'll be ready." The Magister turned and disappeared into the darkness. Holmes watched him go. Then he took a deep breath. The war was over, for now. When he returned to Baker Street, Watson was waiting for him. "Sherlock, where were you? I've been worried since morning." Holmes smiled. "I'm sorry, Watson, but I had something I needed to do. The Golden Book is now in a safe place." "Where?" asked Watson. "I can't say," Holmes replied, "because knowledge puts it in danger. But know this, the book is safe, and I will protect it forever." Watson saw his friend's determination and smiled. "I trust you, Sherlock. I always have." That evening, the two friends sat by the fireplace. Holmes played his violin, this time a cheerful melody, a section from Beethoven's Ode to Joy. Watson listened and felt at peace, but they both knew this wasn't the end. The Magister could return one day, or a new enemy could emerge. The third power was still out there somewhere, watching. But for now, London was peaceful. Snow was falling. The city was sleeping. And Sherlock Holmes had completed his task. Days, weeks, months passed. Life returned to normal. Holmes and Watson were busy with other cases. The case of the Lost Brotherhood slowly faded into the background. But it was never forgotten. One spring morning, Holmes received a letter. On the envelope was a symbol of 3 circles and an eye. Inside was a short message. "Mr. Holmes, the game is not over yet. The third force is watching everything. The day will come when the truth is revealed. And on that day, your choice will matter. Be prepared." Holmes read the letter and burned it. He said nothing to Watson, because some secrets should never be shared. But in his mind, Holmes knew the war continued, just in a different form, and he would always be ready, because Sherlock Holmes was not just a detective. He was the last guardian of the keepers of the light, and he would never abandon his duty. Where is the Golden Book? Who is the third power? Will the Magister return? These questions remain unanswered because some stories are written to never end, and the story of the Lost Brotherhood is one of them. Perhaps one day someone will continue it. Perhaps that someone is you.